Welcome, I'm Denise Graves, and you're watching Opera America's Oral History Project.
Sarah Billinghurst, thank you so much for being with us today. You are just an icon in our industry, and it's an honor to have this time to talk to you. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. I think I'm more a dinosaur than an icon, but anyhow, nice of you to say that.
I'll debate that. I'll stick with icon.
Yeah.
As you know, I start every interview with a question of who brought you to your first opera?
Well, I was born in New Zealand, and I went to a very strict Anglican all-girls boarding school, and we were taken to every musical event that happened in Wellington, the capital city of New Zealand, so that we'd stop thinking about boys. And so they took us to every musical event that they possibly could. And because we wore very neat, dark green uniforms, they always put us at the back of the stage so that they didn't have to put a lot of potted plants there and everything. So the very first person who made me enthusiastic about opera was Victoria de Los Angeles. And I can remember her. She was doing her Australasian tour, as so many musicians did in those days, people like Mal Kaczynski and Oistrakh and all sorts of people. And she was doing a recital in the town hall in Wellington. I can to this day remember she wore an off-the-shoulder bright green taffeta dress, and she played a guitar with her encores, and she sang in between, and I fell in love with opera at that very moment. And then there was a visiting company, or was it the Wellington and New Zealand Opera Company sort of came and went, you know, they came for a year or two, then disappeared and then came back, and they did a Carmen with a singer from the United States, and I don't know who it was, but anyhow, I was very impressed by that. And that's how I began my love of opera.
Wow, with Victoria de Los Angeles, that's starting at the top.
I know, that wasn't bad, was it? And I can remember when I first went to Barcelona, I said to the taxi driver, I want to see where she actually lived. And so he drove past and said, there it is, she lives in the penthouse. You know,
how wonderful. Wonderful.
But that was a wonderful beginning. And then when we moved to San Francisco, I started going to the San Francisco Opera regularly. And the very first opera I saw there was a La Boheme with Freni and Pavarotti. So I started quite well there, and they had a little earthquake in the middle, but everyone just kept on singing. It was very impressive.
How extraordinary, how extraordinary. It wasn't until I did some research that I realized that Caruso actually was in San Francisco on the night of the earthquake. He had sung a performance of Carmen in 1906, and he was back in his hotel after the performance when the earthquake struck. So Pavarotti with an earthquake in San Francisco, Caruso with an earthquake in San Francisco.
Yes, exactly.
Just
and of course,
crazy.
New Zealand is a country with myriad earthquakes, so I was used to it, so it didn't faze me.
Now, you, as I read, you graduated university with a degree in political science. So even though you had enjoyed music and theater and even opera, political science was what you studied at university.
Well, you know, I wanted to be a lawyer, but I had a very old-fashioned father who did not want a daughter to be a lawyer, didn't think women should be lawyers. What can I say? So I studied political science instead, and I thought I was going to live in New Zealand forever and be the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Anyhow, everything changed, of course, when I got married very young, and my husband was a structural engineer who specialized in earthquake areas, and off we went to San Francisco. And that was the beginning of my American sojourn, and I've been here, you know, 55 years since.
Wow. So it was in the late 60s, 1967, that you came to the United States?
67, yeah.
Wow.
That's right.
And began attending at opera at the San Francisco Opera. But
right.
How did you get a first job there?
Well, when we first went to San Francisco, I worked in a PR office, and then I had my first child, and after he was born, I wanted to do something, so someone said, well, why don't you go and volunteer at the opera? So I volunteered at the opera, and you know, Kurt Herbert Adler was good at sniffing out someone who was really interested, or every good singer that there was, and so he offered me a job. and he offered me a job as assistant to Richard Rudzinski. So I started working for him, and then I got divorced, and the job turned into a full-time job, and then Kurt Herbert Adler decided to leave in one brief moment and appointed Terry McEwen, and then decided it was really stupid that he said he was going to leave. And so Terry and I were sort of banished to an inside room that used to be the lunchroom. And I became Terry's artistic administrator. And between us, we planned all his seasons and everything like that. So it was very good that I had some years with Kurt Herbert Adler, really to learn how to deal with singers and how to deal with people and how not to deal with people.
Sure.
I mean, you know, he and Jean-Pierre Pinel, who was always in San Francisco, and they adored each other, but they also had unbelievable public rows, which was not something that I wanted to follow. But, you know, I learned how to deal with people, I think, from reading a lot of Machiavelli and studying political science. And, you know, Hugh Gall was a political scientist too, who used to run the Paris
Opera so brilliantly.
And and also from spending 6 years in a very strict girls' boarding school where you had to have good manners or you were out. So there you are.
You know, great training. But even just now, you've rattled off some names that are so important in the history of American opera, and Richard Rudzinski and his role. He was a major force in opera,
Yes.
you know, half a century ago.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And very knowledgeable, very interesting. And then, of course, he then went and ran the Van Cliburn competition for years and years and years and years.
And Terry McEwen, again, someone who helped shape the recorded history of opera. When every opera is being recorded for the first time, Terry would put together these incredible casts. And
both Kurt Herbert Adler and Terry McEwen had very strong personal relationships with people. I mean, Kurt Herbert Adler had a very strong relationship with Leontine Price, with Birgit Nielsen, with Leonie Wieseneck, and Terry had a very strong relationship with Joan Sutherland and with Luciano and with a lot of people like that. So it was very, very interesting to actually spend time with them and learn from them and see what
and I am getting from this too a message about the fact that personal relationships, you know, these may be great artists, they may be international stars, but the personal relationship is really important to getting them to work for your company and work well for your company.
Absolutely. It's one thing I learned from political science, that politicians have great but fragile egos, and opera singers have exactly the same, and directors and everything else. So that you have to, you know, I'll never forget when Kathy Battle was singing at the San Francisco Opera, and she was not being her easiest. She was very demanding, I think, because she was a perfectionist. So I took her home, and, you know, we both had a glass of champagne and talked about Langston Hughes at length, whose biography I just read, and she is a great Langston Hughes admirer, of course. And somehow that established a way of talking to each other, which was beyond opera, but was incredibly helpful. And you know, I've always thought that at some point I could have been quite good as a psychologist, and I think that was a great help in my whole career, and that I really liked the people, and I really wanted to know more about them, and I really wanted to feel personally close to them as well as professionally, not too personally close. Right. That is always a disaster. Right. But personally close enough that you can actually help people and calm some fears and that sort of thing. You know, early on in my career, I can remember Giacomo Aragal singing Tosca at the San Francisco Opera with Gwyneth Jones, and Gwyneth was an amazing woman, and she sort of sailed on stage with no qualms at all. And you looked over in the wings and there was Giacomo kneeling on the floor and crossing himself, you know, and looking terrified. And he always was. I mean, he had a great fear of singing, even though he had one of the greatest voices ever at the time. So there were a lot of, it's very complicated dealing with singers all the time. And I think it helps if you're sympathetic and empathetic.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Now,
I think that follows today with people also.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. The work with Mr. Adler and the stories are incredible. I never met him. I never knew Mr. Adler, but the stories are incredible. Of, you know, he's deciding to quit at Point Terry McHugh, and then is deciding not to quit. And I've heard of entire departments getting fired and getting rehired the next day, and yet personal relationships with Leontine Price and Leonie Riesnick. So this complicated man. How did it work that this rather explosive, complicated man ran one of the most successful opera companies in the history of this country?
Well, A, he was a perfectionist. B, he knew exactly what he was looking at on stage. He knew if a director was good or if a director was not good. He knew that Jean-Pierre Pinel was brilliant. Even though they had big disagreements about the productions, in the end, it all came together, and it was a kind of moment when the two of them came together in agreement, when something great came out of it. I mean, I'll never forget Ryman's Lear that they did, which was absolutely extraordinary, and the production was extraordinary, and also the Frau Schatten that he did. Well, Jean-Pierre did so many things there, absolutely extraordinary. The Turandot that he did with Montserrat Caballé and Luciano, everything like that. You know, I can remember sitting behind him once, and he said, "You," and he said the name of the woman, "You in the second row of the chorus," say her name was Joan or something, you know, Miss Smith, in the second row of the chorus, "You are wearing red nail polish. Would you please take it off for performances?" He did not miss anything, from the very large picture to the very small picture. He also had, in those days, you could hear someone in Europe and you could hire them for the next season, which is what he did with Birgit Nilsson. And he was extraordinary at finding new singers, finding singers for the San Francisco Opera. And in those days, he had a big and very healthy and very giving board. I think opera is just more difficult to run these days, but in those days, the opera was sort of the pride of San Francisco. And he ran an extraordinary opera house, an extraordinary season. And he asked a lot from himself, and he asked a lot from all of his staff. In those days, if someone yelled at you, you sort of shrugged it off and kept going and learned something from it. These days, you would not.
Right,
right. It was a very different time. Remember, it was, you know, nearly 50 years ago.
Yes, yes.
God.
And of course, there was so much less competition in those days. The European houses weren't yet thriving the way they came to thrive. So these wonderful singers were happy to have these engagements in the United States, and so many important productions. And in San Francisco, before they'd get to the Metropolitan Opera, they were singing in San Francisco.
That's right. That's right. And as I said, he had these wonderful personal relationships also with many, many of the singers. I mean, I can remember when Margaret Price was really ill for the Sam Wanamaker Aida, which was very glitzy in Hollywood, but anyhow, quite extraordinary. And she was ill, and in those days we barely ever had covers, but he had one of his most satisfying moments when he stepped in front of the curtain and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry, but Miss Price is ill tonight and will not be able to sing." You know, the audience sighed and moaned and everything else. And then he said, "But," he said, "singing the role of Aida will be Miss Price, Miss Leontine Price." And that was one of his really best moments.
Well, it would be anyone's best moment.
It sort of sums up what he was and what he did. He was an extraordinary musician. He was not necessarily a great conductor, which you always hoped to be, but he was extraordinary. And he had a very good head of the board too, Richard Miller. Very strong, a very good partner to Kurt Herbert Adler.
Wow. Wow.
Anyhow, those were amazing days.
As your job grew, you were still a mother. You had a family. And
that's right.
How did you balance that? I mean, people weren't speaking about, single parent households or work-life balance in the same way they do today. How did you manage this burgeoning career that you sort of stumbled into and managing a family?
Well, I used to go home to start off with the San Francisco Opera. Seasons have never been as long as the Mets, so that was something. Then my ex-husband remarried again, and they were very helpful with the children and took the children when it was needed. And I would go home every night and cook dinner and have, make sure they were doing their homework, and then go back after that to the opera. And then, later on at 4 a.m, I'd get up and drive my daughter to rowing, which she was doing. And, and then in those days, I used to have lots of parties for all of the artists, and I used to cook and do all sorts of things. When you're younger, it's easier. What can I say? And I am a New Zealander who, like any New Zealander, you just multitask and don't complain.
I know that you are loved by so many artists because of the personal touch that you bring to the opera house, the heart and soul that you bring to the opera house. And here you are talking about you'd be cooking for artists. How did you see your role as hospitality CEO?
I didn't really think about it. I just wanted to do it, so I did it. One thing I want to just go back to Kurt Herbert Adler. One thing I learned from him, I had studied music when I was in New Zealand. I'd played the piano badly, and I'd played the clarinet even more badly, actually, really both of them. And I'd conducted the school chorus and that sort of thing. So I did have music in my background. My mother was intensely musical and a very good pianist. And we listened to a lot of music. So it was always there. But Kurt Herbert Adler, just watching him and listening to him at auditions made me learn what to listen to, what to hear. I don't have perfect pitch or anything like that, but I'm very good at listening to a young singer and finding out if he's got something special. And I can remember, for instance, when Gay Lether and I heard Ryan Speedo Green, and we said he should be in the program. And most of the other people were totally against it. They said he hadn't had enough music education. He was too, sorry about the pun, green, et cetera, et cetera. And we absolutely insisted, and we insisted with Jimmy, and he became a member of the program, and look at him now. So it's people like that. It's trying to find and trying to hear that something special that is not just generic. There's so many singers who are they're lovely singers. They might even have terrific technique, but they're just generic. And you have to have something that that sells you in a different way when you audition, I think. Something that proves that you can get on stage and captivate an audience. And there are many young singers now who can do that. Many who don't.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a moment, because I want to do the shift from West Coast to East Coast. Is after 2 decades at the San Francisco Opera, you relocated to New York into the Metropolitan Opera, and how did you decide that at that point in your life you were ready to take on an even bigger challenge across the country?
Well, I had been working then for Lotfi Mansouri, who I'd known for years and years before he became general director of the San Francisco Opera. And I really enjoyed working with him. I particularly enjoyed working on War and Peace, where we hired Valery Gergiev, who I know is persona non grata now, but in those days it was very different, and it was very exciting that we started off a relationship with the Mariinsky, or the Kirov as it was there, and San Francisco Opera, and did a co-production of Ruslan and Ludmilla and a lot of other things. Anyhow, that was very exciting with Lotfi. But then, you know, I'd been in San Francisco a long time. My son was already in graduate school. My daughter was going to go to the University of Chicago, which was a wonderful university, but certainly not cheap. And my ex-husband could only contribute so much, and I could not contribute very much either. So I decided, when Joe Volpe approached me and said, would you be interested in working at the Met? I decided that I would earn a lot more money in New York, not realizing how expensive New York was, and that I needed another challenge in my life. And so I moved to New York, and my daughter continued on at the University of Chicago with no college bills at the end of it. So that was very important.
Congratulations on that front.
Anyhow, so I moved to New York. I think Joe thought I was a totally different person than I was, and that I would be very good at negotiating with unions and things like that, which I'd never done, and you know, really had no desire to do, frankly. There are a lot of people who can do that sort of thing better than me. But in the end, we worked out a way of working together, and I think I was helpful to him, and I certainly learned a lot from working with him.
In going to the Met, was it just a longer season, or were there other differences that you had or had not anticipated in going from San Francisco to the Met?
Well, one of the joys of going was the orchestra. I mean, to go and to hear that orchestra in every performance with Jimmy, it was so extraordinary. It really was. That was one of the highlights. And of course, the longer season made it more interesting. There were more roles to cast. There were more singers to know internationally. It just was a bigger and in the end, more fulfilling job. And I didn't have children at home by then, so
right, and completely consuming job, you know, all consuming.
Yes, all consuming.
We just touched on young artists, and you know, your work with established artists, your sensitivity to them, the empathy, the hospitality. Is supporting a young artist just the same thing, or is there a whole different set of skills that you bring to the table when you are helping rising young singers?
Well, you know, I sort of did that a little from afar, because at the Met there was always someone who was running the young artist program and someone who was musically running it and everything else. So I was not as involved with them as I was in San Francisco. But I think you have to treat young artists even more carefully than you treat established artists, because established artists have all that that behind them. They've been on many stages. They've faced many different directors, some of whom they loathed, but still gave good performances for and everything. And young artists need to learn all of that. So, you know, I could give them the kind of advice of be very well prepared and really be as facile as you could be in as many languages as you could be. I think that that's incredibly important. And I think also to say to them and to make them realize that it is not the end of the world if they did not get the kind of career that they wanted, that there are many other kinds of careers. There are careers in opera administration. Many singers have gone into opera administration. There, you don't just have to become a teacher. There are, you can become, as many wonderful singers did, members of the Met Chorus or of other choruses, which are very fulfilling and very good. So I think that you have to also make sure that the young singers do know there are alternatives. I am very much one for encouraging people to learn how to be artistic administrators and to learn how to be administrators in general in many different parts of the opera world. Because I think if you've got a singer's background, if you've got pianist background or something like that, that helps with the opera, that I think that these people can also become great administrators, and that this is what opera companies should be concentrating on, both with diverse people, with a diverse population. It's ridiculous that they're not more Black administrators, and there should be, because there are a lot of very good people out there who would be extraordinary, but they've never had the chance to come into an opera company and work in a smaller, lower position and learn and be mentored.
You raise a very good point that you can study business, you can get an MBA, there are courses for fundraising. There are many paths to develop certain skills, but to be an artistic administrator, there really isn't coursework for that.
No, I mean, you do have to, it's very useful to be able to read a budget and to know how to put a budget together. I think that's incredibly important, and those are courses that can be taken, but otherwise there's certain things that can't be taught. You sort of just have to get them by osmosis.
And being a singer is a primary mode of osmosis in terms of learning repertoire, learning how operas are put together, learning in order to have empathy, to have been a singer, you know what it is to be a singer, and it enables you to be supportive of other artists. Yeah,
I agree.
Now, the opera repertoire. When you started at San Francisco Opera, new works were few and far between, and if they took place on the stage, they were probably European and not American new operas. And over the course of your career, we've seen this incredible burgeoning of American opera, blossoming of American opera, works of different scope, different subject matter, different style of composition. Are you pleased with what you are seeing in the development of American opera?
Yes, definitely. I'm absolutely delighted. I think it's wonderful what's happening. I really do. And this, I go to the opera all the time. I've decided, forget my ballet subscription, that's gone. I'm going to just go to the opera and Carnegie Hall and the New York Philharmonic. But I love the new pieces. I went to see all of them 2 or 3 times. And I went to see Eurydice also in Los Angeles before it came to the Met, because I was very interested to see how it changed and how it blossomed. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that all these operas are being written. I worry a little about the fact they're going to be performed once in a season and disappear. And that, I think, is a big worry. I think it's great when you have something, to get back to Santa Fe Opera, you have something like the Steve Jobs Opera, which already had many performances in many opera companies in place, which I think was absolutely terrific. And I would hope that Hamlet will continue to go to other places, and Eurydice, and of course, Fire Shut My Bones, but I think that will go to many places. I think that's very important, but I also think it's very important that they have a program such as the one which produced Intimate Apparel, which was superb. Did you see it?
I did.
Really, really excellent. And I saw Lynn Nottage 2 days ago, and I said to her, I do hope you're doing other librettos. And she said, yes, I'm doing 2 actually. Well, when you get people like that caliber doing librettos, which are nearly as important as the composition itself, then I think there's great hope for future operas, because so many operas have been destroyed by really bad libretti.
Yes,
I feel
it's true. It's true. In the national demographic report that we just we did a little preview of yesterday, we found that the majority of opera administrators are people who identify as female. And even if you separate out those who have the title of director of something from other staff, still people who identify as women are in the majority. And yet we do not see many female general directors of major companies or in some of the senior positions. And here, you for half a century have had a leading role in American opera. Did you encounter barriers to your career advancement? If you did, how did you overcome them?
Well, I really didn't, because I always liked being number two and I never wanted to be number one. I mean, there's a funny story that they asked me at Covent Garden to join Michael Kaiser in running Covent Garden for one brief moment, but I just met Howard, who became my husband, and we were just sort of settling that. And I loved my job at the Met, really, really enjoyed it immensely, and felt I could contribute more here in a place that I knew, rather than over in London, who are naturally somewhat skeptical about colonial New Zealanders. So no, I never felt there were barriers, because I was where I wanted to be. I'm sure for many other people there have been barriers.
Yeah.
I don't think now so much.
No, I think they are diminishing, but I still think they exist. And
I think they still exist. And I think that if you are on a search committee looking for someone to run an opera company, there are not necessarily as many obvious women to do that as there are men. I mean, I think Houston did a great job.
Oh, great job.
And of course, there were great women in the past, like Carol Fox and
artists.
Artists, of course, and people like that. But on the whole, it has been men who've been running.
Yeah, and I think there are more and more women who are very able and very visible for some of the positions that are or will be opening. And I do challenge boards and the transition committees at boards, don't be subject to the bias that somehow the man really knows how to run the company and the woman isn't as skilled at it. And I still think that bias exists, and we just need to keep working on it, because frankly, the short list of any search right now will have lots and lots of names of very qualified women.
Yes, I agree. And that's where you can give advice and be extremely helpful. But I think that 40 years ago, there were not a lot of qualified women. And I think this goes back to the training of administrators of any kind within opera companies, which I think is so important. And I think it's very important that women are very involved with this, and that, as I said, that also that the people there are very diverse.
In my conversation with Simon Estes, which we had referenced a little bit earlier today, he talked about his early engagements in the United States. He had had such success in Europe, but not in the United States. And the two companies that really gave him juicy roles early on in the US were Sarah Caldwell in Boston and Carol Fox in Chicago. And he brought up very clearly that it was the women who were leading those companies who gave him the chance when the other companies were closed to him as a Black leading man. So I think there is an important intersection between women in leadership positions and the openness of the organization to new people and new talent.
I think that's right. And I think in the past also, there was not an openness to women in many roles. I mean, you only have to watch Mad Men, and everything, and look at the state of many different kinds of businesses and everything, where women were just really not welcomed as lawyers, even as doctors and things. And it's changed drastically now.
Yeah, and for the better,
Much, very much for the better.
You mentioned your love of music generally. I know that you just love chamber music, symphonic music, opera. And I'm curious to know, within this larger musical life that you lead, where does opera fit in contrast to some of these other arts that you love?
Well, I think opera is always first, because I mean, that's where I work. That's what thrills me most. But I mean, I get a lot of pleasure from things like the weekend before last, I went to the Ojai Festival and heard AMUC, the American Modern Opera Coalition, I heard their 4 days festival that they did there, which was extraordinary, and which did include a new sort of opera from Matt, and also included a children's opera that was a total delight outdoors in a park from Doug Ballard. So I love modern music, and I love, well, not all modern music. I like some modern music, and I'm always very interested in supporting small commissions and things like that. I wish I could do more, but I can't. But I do like to do that, and you know, I've got more time now, so
yes,
I am on several boards, so I am busy.
For sure. I know you're on
Everyone
many,
is always asking me, don't I miss the Met? And I say, well, why? You know, I can sit in the box, I can love a performance, and if I really hate a performance, I can leave at the intermission and no one knows. So,
or people may know, but it doesn't matter.
exactly, I know. So anyhow, but
I
that
know,
very rarely happens.
you know, I see you at Carnegie Hall. I know how you get out to see so much and really keep your finger on the pulse of new work, of traditional work, of young artists. I am amazed at how completely current you are with what's going on. And do you just spend a lot of time talking to people? Is it that you are out a lot? How do you keep up the way you do?
Well, one of the things is that very sadly, my husband died at the beginning of this year, and he's been sick for quite a while. And so, you know, I used to go out at nights after we had dinner together and that sort of thing. And it was a source of great interest and great solace. And now that he's not here, I mean, if I want to go to opera every night, I can go, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't do that, of course. How do I do it? Well, I'm very organized. I already have booked all my tickets for Carnegie Hall for the next season, all my tickets for the opera. I know exactly what I'm going to do at Santa Fe Opera. I will immediately book my Juilliard tickets at the moment that we get the schedule for Juilliard. You know, so I am very organized so that I make sure I don't have an opera on the same night as a Carnegie Hall concert I want to go to, and et cetera, et cetera. All my friends think it's absolutely nuts, but for me, it's a way of sort of organizing my life. You know.
For sure, or missing something because you forgot to plan ahead and suddenly it's gone.
It's sold out. Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
I know.
Missed it.
So I do that, and I must admit I do less of going to things like Butterfly, Tosca, Bohème, Turandot. You know, things that I've seen so many times. It has to be a very special cast.
Sure.
I will go to any Mozart at any time, any Wagner at any time, a lot of Verdi, not all of it,
Yeah.
and anything modern, different,
Yeah.
any Benjamin Britten. You know, I love going to Philip Glass operas, but not, I mean, I don't go several times like I did to Hamlet.
Yeah.
Once to Akhenaten and 3 times to Hamlet. That sort of thing.
Well,
I love going to performances of little opera companies like On-Site Opera and Heartbeat Opera, and I've always supported them in a very minor way, but I think they're terrific. I think they're terrific what they do up at Columbia at the up there where they did one of Missy's pieces. Was it before COVID? I think that was very interesting, Proving Up.
And that is such a difference from just a few years ago. The number of these artist-driven companies that really are reinterpreting what opera is, where it can be performed, and you know, now that you can market without brochures by doing it through social media or a website, companies are just being inventive the way they never were 20 or 30 years ago.
And the good thing about especially about the 2 companies that I mentioned, which I'm very familiar with, is that their casting tends to be very good. I mean, yes, it's not the Met, but you don't expect it to be. And therefore, it's very interesting to audiences who've not been to opera.
Yeah.
Which I think is terrific and encourages people eventually to perhaps go to the Met. But, you know, did you see the Mother of Us All that they did at the Metropolitan Museum?
Yes.
That was extraordinary. And that was that was sort of a coalition of Juilliard and New York Philharmonic and wonderful singers, and quite amazing. So I think the more those sort of things are done, the better.
Wow. So my final question, what music will you hear this evening?
Actually, I'm going out to dinner with a friend. And so
no music
tonight.
tonight.
But I did go to Bach last night. Very interesting program. And then I'm going to Carramore on Friday to a chamber music concert that the wonderful Anthony McGill will be in. And then I'm going to a pianist at Carramore on Sunday. So there is a lot of music. And then I'm going to England and we're going to Garsington to hear the English concert in Orfeo, and I'm on the board of the American Friends of the English Concert. So I'll do that. So,
Sarah, you are inspiring. It is incredible.
No, but it inspires me to keep going.
Wow.
Every so often I pinch myself and say, oh my God, am I nearly 80? I really feel in some ways that it's 50 years ago and I'm just starting at the San Francisco Opera. So, it's an ongoing and wonderful joy to me to be involved in this world.
Well, thank you for taking time from that incredible schedule to speak with me today. Thank you for all you do for all of the arts in New York, for Opera America. You are just an ally, an advocate, and a great friend, Sarah. I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I love doing anything with you too, Mark. So
I appreciate that.
Okay,
We'll
thank
talk
you very
soon.
much.
Thanks
All
a
right,
million.
bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.